now to move on to our last panel discussion, which looks at the opportunities and concerns outlined in the planning white paper for the heritage sector. I'd like to welcome Stephanie Evans from the National Trust to join us, who will be chairing the discussion. Stephanie is head of placemaking and design and advises on development projects from new build to adaptive reuse. So on to you, Stephanie.
There we are. Remember to press the mute button. Thanks very much, Hannah, and thank you for actually including me in today's session this morning. I found it hugely stimulating, and I've got quite a few takeaways that I'll be taking back to the National Trust for further discussion. So thanks very much for inviting me. So welcome to the last session for today, opportunities and concerns outlined in the planning white paper for the heritage sector. As Hannah says, my name is Stephanie Evans. I work at the National Trust. I've been there for 17 years, and before that I worked in the public sector for design and heritage teams within local authorities, and ending up being the head of development control at the Brecon Beacons National Park. So this is a really stimulating area for me to be involved with today. So we'll follow the normal pattern for today. We've got 3 excellent panelists who are going to speak for about 7 minutes each. Hannah has very kindly offered to sound the gong when they're 6 minutes into their presentation. And then at the end, we'll have some questions and discussion, which I'm looking forward to. And Hannah has actually given me a little bit of time to actually say a little bit about what the National Trust is doing in response to the white paper. So I'm just going to take a few minutes to do that. We're very busy finalising our response at the moment. As you know, there's only about a week to go, but we are heading that way. The reflections that I'm just going to offer really are in relation to Pillar 2 effectively, because my interest obviously is heritage design and placemaking. But I'd just like to, a little bit of context is the Trust does look after 28,000 buildings across the UK, and pre-pandemic, we had something like £250 million worth of projects ongoing at any one time. So a lot of these things are very dear to our hearts. So there's a number of things in the white paper that I think we really warmly welcome. They're mainly principles, I think. So the emphasis on placemaking, on quality development and sustainability, that's great. And it's obviously stimulating an awful lot of conversations, which is really good to see. And the intention to engage communities in creating place-based planning frameworks, we really welcome that, and it's something that we're really trying to encourage with respect to our own places, the places that we manage, because they've become incredibly important green spaces for particularly local communities during the pandemic. We really support the idea that the development plan phase of the planning process is really critical to get right. So we welcome the shift in emphasis really on, more shift on emphasis towards the development plan phase of the planning process. However, we do feel the white paper is strong on principle and slightly weaker on detail. And we're very interested in how these principles and objectives are going to be delivered. And as we all know, the devil, or should we say in this case, the success is going to be in the detail. So the challenges, the 3 challenges I wanted to pick out is how will the resource to significantly strengthen the capability of local planning authorities in design, placemaking, neighbourhood planning and sustainability be made available, and who's going to pay for that? The second one will be, will time be safeguarded in the planning process to ensure that design guidance and master planning has been put together with communities and is in place before areas are allocated as either growth, renewal or protection? And the third issue, it's something Claire picked up earlier in her presentation, is will heritage and to a less degree nature, I think, be increasingly confined to protected areas? Will these areas be stifled of innovation and change? Will they become pickled in aspic? And what does that say about our society and the polarization of society? So that's a concern. And I just want to finish the introduction by saying my own view is that heritage and nature are as an important part of placemaking as functionality, safety, green space, connectivity, aesthetics, legibility. The heritage and nature are just as important as those things in creating great places to live where people want to live. And people's affinity to place, their desire to nurture and protect it, comes from the feeling that it's their place and that they have a stake in it. So that's me. I'll climb down from my soapbox and I'll introduce our first panelist, Eve Blaze, who's the operations manager for the Creative Land Trust. And the Creative Land Trust works to secure and protect affordable studio space for artists in London and the UK. And Eve advises and brokers opportunities in the property sector that respond to local community needs. He's a trustee of art commissioning and production charity Forma, and is an active advocate for cultural infrastructure and creative production in urban centres. So without further ado, Eve, can I ask you to start your presentation?
Hi, thank you, Stephanie. Thanks for that introduction. Thanks to Hannah and everyone for having me today. I have to share my screen. How do I do that? Let me get back to this. That's the one. I'm going to put my timer on, so I'm keeping to time. Has that worked? Can you see my screen?
Just to say, Eve, Hannah will give you a gong at 6 minutes, okay? And yes, we can see your screen.
Thank you. Okay, I'm just trying to put it into slideshow mode. Sorry. Right, there we go. So as Stephanie just said, I am the operations manager at the Creative Land Trust. Previously to the Creative Land Trust, I've worked in the art sector for 12 years, working different galleries as a curator. And I'm going to speak to you today a little bit about the Creative Land Trust, just to give you an introduction there on it, and its place within the creative industries, also around cultural venues and creative workspaces. Then I'll speak a little bit about our response to the paper and its impacts and potential opportunities for the creative sector itself. So Creative Land Trust is a new charity. It was just set up last year. Its mission is to secure permanent workspaces for the artists and creative community to be run across London and hopefully in the future also around the UK, to provide really truly affordable workspace at affordable rents. We're backed by the Mayor of London, Arts Council England and Bloomberg Philanthropies, and the ambition is to take on long leases over 25 years and freehold properties that will provide spaces for art production and creative uses that really sit at the heart of healthy communities. And our vision is that these spaces activate neighborhoods, but critically are inclusive and become a real reflection of the communities that they sit in. So where does that sit within the creative industries? Well, maybe you all know this, but to give you some relevance around the creative industries, it generates £56 billion to the UK economy every year, and 1 in 6 jobs in London are in the creative industries. London is the most Googled city in the world for culture, and 30,000 new art and design graduates leave college each year. England has some of the world's most important cultural venues and is a global leader in fashion, design, gaming, music, performance, and film production. And the whole thing sits together in a very fragile, interdependent, but kind of invisible ecology. And the creative industries, the creative workspace is really important in that whole ecosystem, because the creative industries are actually supported by a myriad of small businesses, from carpentry to food production, to designers, to craftspeople and artists. And they all need these truly affordable studios to invent and create. So allowing space to create studio clusters will make for more attractive creative hubs in our urban centers, and in turn respond to and activate neighborhoods. They provide opportunities for local employment, of course, create skill development for young people in the community, and lock in social and economic value into a neighborhood for the benefit of the existing community. But in London alone, over the last few years, we've lost 35% of grassroots venues over a period of about 10 years, 27% of pubs over about 16 years, a loss of numerous LGBTQIA+ venues, and over the last 3 years, over 17% of artists' workspaces. And this is only intensified, actually. This was pre-COVID, so it's only been intensified by the pandemic. And really what it's down to is short leases running out. And so there's real need to try and incorporate long-term cultural infrastructure into plans at pre-planning stage. So the need for reform is clearly needed. And the Planning for the Future paper that came out has lots of good in it. And we decided to come together as a consortium of organizations. So Creative Land Trust with Sound Diplomacy, Music Venues Trust, Outset Contemporary Art Fund, and the Nighttime Industries Association have written a discussion paper that responds to the paper in light of what it's doing for the creative sector. And really it's asking the question, what kind of places do we want? Prioritizes, importantly, housing, but this will put a pressure on low or loss-making cultural venues and low-rent affordable workspaces. The thinking, is freeholders who own them will be less likely to support their leaseholder, especially if their property falls within the newly designated growth or renewal zones. And this will result in the risk of displacement or even disappearance of some of these venues and workspaces. The new permitted development rights allows for the demolition and rebuilding of what they call vacant and redundant light industrial buildings to become homes, but this will drastically reduce the number of sites that are really available as workspaces for the creative sector and other uses, and consequently will harm the communities and reduce local employment opportunities. I'll come to section 106 shortly, but essentially what we're seeing is a potential for residential deserts being created in our urban centers. So what are the opportunities? Well, we feel that building on the current systems in the view of the failing high streets and the impetus for higher density residential zoning, there can be parallel systems that could be designs that provide cultural assets and land uses with real bespoke protections. So for instance, we have imagined up a new cultural infrastructure levy within the proposed new infrastructure levy, which of course focuses on monies going into housing, but this will mean that there's less space for the creative spaces. Section 106, which is a clause which, over the numerous years has actually enabled the presence of creative workspaces in numerous developments, which has been absolutely crucial, that kind of funding, appears to be being eradicated. Whereas we would propose a kind of reform to the Section 106 agreement, which would split out payments specifically for culture and protect culture. We also think that strengthening combined authorities like the Greater London Authority, like West Midlands and Greater Manchester would be significant because their role in supporting music, culture, art, and the nighttime economy has always been something to capitalize on. And something slightly aside from the planning paper is business rates, which is in review at the same time by the government. We feel that the system should reflect much more towards business turnover alongside or over land value. I guess the final opportunity that the paper has provided is creating a unified voice. Certainly for us, the consortium coming together has allowed us to share knowledge and sector experience so that we become stronger as a unit. And so, you know, I really hope that this can happen more. And, you know, it's conversations like today that really propel that further. So thank you. That's my presentation. I'll just come out of the shared screen. There we are. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Eve. That was great. And again, I've picked up on some more ideas that I might want to follow up, really, conversations with the National Trust. But let's move on, and we'll come back to some of the ideas that you raised in your session at the end of this, the three panelists. So can I now introduce Dr. Rob Lennox, who is the Senior Advocacy Coordinator for the Chartered Institute of Archaeologists, or CIFA, and he works alongside the CIFA membership in developing policy and advocating policy to government and the wider heritage sector. And he's going to talk about the challenges of the planning white paper for archaeology. So Rob, are you there?
Yes, thank you very much, Stephanie. Thank you to Hannah and to everybody else who's spoken this morning. It's been really fantastic and interesting papers. So I work for the Chartered Institute for Archaeology, as Stephanie says, and CIFA has been looking really closely at the white paper, the so-called radical structural changes that it outlines. And it's great to be part of this panel because we've been working across the heritage and environment sectors and with other bodies. And there's a huge range of issues of relevance throughout all of the 20-odd proposals in the white paper. But there are a few specifically archaeological issues that I'd like to focus on in my 5 minutes today. So CIFA's members work in all parts of the archaeological profession, but the majority work for archaeological organisations that deliver work through the planning system. And this reflects where most archaeological research is undertaken. Professional archaeologists in the planning system do several things. They advise on how to use archaeological heritage to add value to development. They advise on how to avoid, minimise and mitigate harm to heritage assets. And they undertake work to offset unavoidable harm through knowledge gain and engaging and involving the public in those processes. So for the last 30 years, archaeology has been comprehensively safeguarded within the planning system. That it follows environmental principles of polluter pays and the precautionary principle. And through those principles, local planning authorities have been able to request that archaeological assessment is undertaken by developers and paid for by them in order to inform the determination of planning permissions. Now, this involvement in the planning system in a comprehensive way has really revolutionised the archaeology sector, and the sheer amount of information that we've been able to gather about the past from many thousands of investigations that occur through the system. It's not without its signs of age. It's 30 years old. Notions of heritage have moved on quite a lot since then. But the white paper represents a considerable shake-up of this system and those roles that I described. So we're trying to look at the white paper with cautious positivity. As people say, there's a lot of good things in there, good principles, maybe not so much on the detail. We're not naive, however, about the government's recent track record on planning, nor the risks that it poses. But what we want to make sure is that we grasp the opportunities to make improvements to the system where they're being presented. So at present, that lack of detail that Stephanie mentioned, we're looking at it as an opportunity. And we've been given encouraging signs that the government is willing to listen to the concerns and to seek some positive outcomes. So, for example, the white paper puts an emphasis in its development area proposal on upfront assessment of development so that you can ascertain the principle of that development at the plan making stage. And there are potential advantages that can come from this. So, the proposed system for growth areas that produces an automatic outline consent after the local plan process has decided what it wants in any particular area, effectively front loads where the decision making happens and where you need the information. So that's before there's a developer bringing forward a specific plan. So if the government does this in a way that requires proportionate assessment of those sites to be undertaken at this early stage, now that could come with some real advantages. It might allow, for instance, for a more strategic approach to how we target archaeological research. a clearer way to identify potential and to guide where that development happens and what might be appropriate and how heritage might add value to it. So it could be less about mitigating harm and more about being part of the planning of what that development looks like, giving you better opportunities to create public benefit. It could also mean that archaeologists are more involved at the strategic planning phase, more embedded within those kind of wider expertise that goes into plan making and placemaking. The proposals also give us an interesting opportunity to talk about the ways that we fund the current system. So polluter pays is a really strong principle, but it's kind of limited in the way that it is essentially a payment by a developer to offset the damage that they are causing to the specific site that they're developing. The Communities and Local Government Committee has done work into alternate land value capture mechanisms, and the white paper proposals could be a way to unlock new routes to funding, how we do that polluter pays sort of approach. Essentially charging developers where there is a land price rise attached to a policy decision, in this case, where land is put into a growth area. So money levied at that stage of allocation could pay for archaeological assessment potentially, but not necessarily constrained to an individual land parcel. It could be shared around the growth zone, allowing you to have more interesting ways that you can examine where and how you want to focus your archaeological interventions. Think of it as less digging every single post hole and more focusing where there is something really important that we can learn about the historic environment. Another thing that the white paper presents by way of an opportunity is that it focuses the mind. There's an external threat, and while there is fantastic work going on in the sector to develop professional practice, innovative ways of doing things, the white paper really focuses us on that, and I think it will lead us to accelerate the research into things like data-driven modelling methodologies that allow us to predict better where heritage assets are likely to occur and what interventions we might want to make there, ultimately enhancing the amount of public benefit that we're able to produce per pound spent on archaeology. And that helps the government's objectives to speed up, make planning more effective and efficient as well. I've not left much time for my concerns, but that's because they're pretty broad. The major concern is that if we don't get a chance to explore these positive potentials, and none of these things are going to happen automatically, there could be serious disruption to those established safeguards for the historic environment. We know that heritage can fall between the cracks when it's not well understood by those driving the reforms, and MHCLG are not heritage specialists. And number 10, where a lot of this is coming from, are definitely not heritage specialists. So we know that that's going to be a tricky battle. We also know that government is unlikely to be amenable to spending lots more money. We can't just say we'd like to do an archaeological survey of the whole country. So it's going to be about proportionality and about making our case as strongly as possible. That's why we're setting kind of very clear red lines about needing to maintain that ability to assess archaeological potential and need to have robust mechanisms for site-specific mitigation, how things are done currently through planning conditions. Similar process is going to have to be in place. So I think that's about it for me. So I'll pass that back to Stephanie, if that's okay.
Thank you very much, Rob. Lots of things there that we've been talking about as well inside the National Trust, so a bit of familiarity. Great, thanks very much, Rob. And we'll come back to you at the end when we've heard from Stephanie. So finally, I'd like to introduce our last panelist, Dr. Stephanie Ray, who I know has had a very busy morning. She's already been speaking to the Rail Consortium, I think, this morning. So we're very pleased that she could join us. And Stephanie is the director and founder of Nature Positive, and the director of RSK Wilding. She's a biodiversity consultant with over 25 years experience of advising government and others on biodiversity policy and assessing the impact of development and land use change on biodiversity. Steph is a past president of the Chartered Institute of Ecology and Environmental Management and currently heads up the strategic policy panel. And Steph's talk today is biodiversity first, the key to sustainable placemaking. So over to you, Steph.
Thanks very much. Now, hopefully I can get you to see my slides. There we go. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about biodiversity, and probably that's a bit strange in a heritage conference, but obviously we think that the natural heritage and built heritage can often be considered together in many ways. And what I'd like to put to you is that biodiversity really is central in sustainable placemaking, and it's often treated as a bit of an afterthought or an esoteric interest of strange people in wellies who go out and look for rare plants. But actually, I think it needs to be more front and centre in what we're doing, and I'm going to talk a little bit about why I think the white paper hasn't really achieved that. So just so that we're all on the same page, what is biodiversity? Well, this is the official definition, if you like. That's been around since the Rio conference in 1992, I think. And I wasn't keen on the definition then. It hasn't grown on me. I think largely because a lot of people don't know what on earth it is we're talking about. And in one recent survey, the majority of participants thought that biodiversity was probably a kind of washing powder. So, when I'm talking about biodiversity, I'm talking about nature, the natural environment, and all of the goods and services that nature provides for us. So, to borrow from Monty Python, what has the environment ever done for us? Well, it's only the food and the fuel, the minerals, the carbon sequestration, the pollination services, water purification, the flood regulation, and so on. But particularly relevant to what we've been talking about today, the cultural services, the sort of recreational, spiritual, cultural, the feeling of awe that you can get from nature. So all of these things are really central, in my view, to how we do planning and how we do placemaking. Now, in my industry, and from CIEM, we're part of an organisation called Greener UK, which is an alliance across lots of environmental NGOs who've been tracking what we think the effects of Brexit will be on environment policy and on how the different elements of the environment will be post the EU exit. And we look at climate, air quality, water, waste, the natural environment, farming and fisheries. And across all of those dimensions, at the moment, we're predicting significant risks, significant environmental risks to the security of those elements of the natural environment that support all of us and all of our businesses. So you've all heard various speeches by Boris and potentially by George Eustace about well, firstly about scapegoating newts for delays in building, and we as a profession, I suppose, are currently trying to balance the messaging that we're getting between we want to protect the environment, we're signing up to the post-2020 global framework, we've got our 25-year environment plan, and then well, it's just these silly newt botherers who are getting in our way and we need to build, build, build. So this is, I suppose, why the white paper worries us in some ways. Not just the slanderous attack on our newt counting ways, but let's start with this issue of beauty. Heritage people, what is all of that about? We're finding that the government appears to be conflating environment and beauty and sort of dumbing down all of those dimensions of what the environment provides to us into just the one dimension. Oh, does it look pretty? That's not what we all believe it to be. And I'm very concerned that the Prime Minister is conflating those issues when he talks about that we've signed up to the global targets of 30% of the land under some protection for nature conservation. The government line is that we're already at 26%. And they're saying that because they're including AONBs, they're including national parks in those things, they're including Greenbelt. That's not what those policies are about. Those policies are not about biodiversity conservation. They're not about wider ecosystem service conservation. They're, a broader range of policies around landscape and in some cases around outdated means of development control. They're certainly not going to protect biodiversity. So we need a planning framework. We need a structure that actually understands the environment as a starting point. Secondly, I think our concerns are around the simplified zoning system. So the sort of, here's where you can build, here's where you can probably build, and here's where it's supposed to be protected. So that just means you go through this process we have at the moment, and then you can probably build on it. That isn't enough. You know, we need a category of natural resources that are actually protected, the things that support us all, you know, river catchments, areas of ancient woodland, things that are actually protecting all of our livelihoods. So you wouldn't put a high-speed rail link, for example, through St Paul's Cathedral and then offer to build a new one. Ancient woodlands, by definition, are older than St Paul's Cathedral. Limestone pavements genuinely cannot be recreated, and yet by special pleading we can destroy these. And that's why we need the protected tier of any zoning system to actually mean something. Perhaps we need a fourth zone of highly protected or inalienable resources. Another thing that concerns me as a practitioner is that when we come to do environmental impact assessment for proposed developments, sometimes we get to issues that we just can't resolve because the decision that this land is being zoned in a particular way, it's been decided at the plan stage. So we might, you know, if the land's allocated, there's only so far we can go with changing things. So in principle, I support some of the movements in the white paper towards doing more upfront work and dealing with a lot of issues at the planning stage. Gosh, an actual return to spatial planning. But when that's paired with the watering down of that EIA, the government saying that EIA is too complex a process and we need to simplify it and we need to make it quicker, then that is a concern. Automatic planning permission in one tier is terrifying to me. We simply don't have the data in much the same way as you don't have cultural heritage data on underground archaeology. We don't have the data on the natural environment. We don't know what we would be destroying in that. If you were going to have a strategy where you said, these are the areas where we'll definitely build, and these are the areas where we definitely won't build, you need good data to base that on, and you need the area to be that you won't build on to be really quite big. And you know, we are talking a third of the country entirely devoted to that. So really, I welcome the idea of a planning reform. I'm very nervous about some of the policies in this one because I don't think they're backed by science, and I don't think they'd really deliver what the natural environment needs. But there are still reasons to be cheerful. We're seeing through the enactment of the Environment Act, which we're expecting early next year now, that there'll be a requirement for 10% net biodiversity gain for development projects under the Town and Country Planning Act. We've seen a commitment in the 25-year environment plan for a move from biodiversity net gain to environmental net gain. So building on biodiversity and then adding in those other ecosystem services. So will it also sequester carbon? Will it also provide habitat for protected species? Will it also help manage flood risk and so on? Both of those elements will help support some of the initiatives we've seen around rewilding, putting larger areas of the countryside back to a more natural state, which links into the new proposals in the Agriculture Act for Environmental Land Management Scheme, where farmers won't just get paid for owning land by the acreage, they'll get paid for actually delivering public benefits in return for that public money. And then, of course, we've got the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework, which is coming out of the Conference of the Parties, delayed from Kunming round about now to currently it's planned to be May next year. Now, our government has already signed up to the draft framework and the 0.5 framework that's currently available. They're very positive about it, and that could lead to a whole range of changes in how we interact with biodiversity and make it more central in how we plan land use in our spatial planning, planning out our natural infrastructure as well as our physical infrastructure, making companies report on their biodiversity framework, on their biodiversity impacts. And if we use biodiversity in this way as a lens to look at all of the different dimensions of sustainability, including those cultural ones, then we can actually perhaps change our way of thinking, rethink the economic system as though the environment that it's all situated in actually matters, and make a better job of sustainable placemaking. That's all I wanted to say as an introduction. Thank you.
Oh, thanks very much, Stephanie. That was great. Could I just invite Rob and Eve to switch on their videos as well as we move into the final discussion part of this particular part of the agenda? I think we've got around 18 minutes for discussion, which is great. It feels quite generous to me. I just wanted to say, really, I think that those three presentations were a really good illustration for me as to why heritage, the creative sector, and the natural environment are as important part of placemaking as beauty and just simply sustainability. Obviously, those things are important too, but placemaking, great placemaking, is far more complex and diverse than that. And I think we've had a really good illustration of that today. I'm going to switch to the Q&A session because I want to give the people that are participating the greatest use of time today. So please get busy out there, participants, with your Q&As, and we will kick off. So reading from the Q&A session, I think Barry has just made a point really to you, Eve, that it's not just about London, but there's great things happening in other parts of the country, and I'm guessing you know that, and I'm sure you'll have clocked that comment, but I don't know if you want to say anything in response to that.
Yes, I come from a sort of London focus at the moment. We're hugely aware that towns and cities around the rest of the UK are also struggling, both from too many people, too much, not enough space, but also from the opposite, where there's a lot of empty space out there. My lens is one of London at the moment, because the problem for the creative sector, at least in London at the moment, is particularly acute, and we have a vision, of sort of 5-year vision of looking at supporting cities and towns in other parts of the country. There's a place for bringing in creative economies where they don't yet exist, and actually trying to disperse some of that. We see the migration of artists to Margate, to Manchester, which is great for those places, and we want to see more of that. So where we can support there, I think that, and actually bring in really affordable workspaces there as well, it makes a huge amount of sense.
Okay, thank you. Thanks, Eve. So I'm going to move on to question 2 from Sarah Rodriguez. And again, I think it's mainly focused to you, Eve. So come on, you archaeology and natural environment people out there, get questioning. So Sarah's question is, the absolute loss of creative venues is fascinating, given the centrality of culture in planning documents, and in particular, the rejuvenation of certain creative hubs. Does Eve think certain areas are becoming more important culturally as hubs at the expense of overall cultural enrichment? Or is the interpretation of creative or cultural becoming more specific or limited and less inclusive?
I think that's a really important question that we're constantly trying to think through. And it goes back to my point around you don't want to helicopter in anything into a community. It's all already there, and it's all about trying to reflect what's already available. There are hubs out there. In London anyway, you think of the Hackneys and the Peckhams at the moment, the South Bank, and they're in other cultural town centres. There are other places too. We look at at the moment, we're looking at opportunity versus need. Where is the most need? And then also thinking, where could we go and actually support communities that could have more infrastructure in place. One of our goals is over the next 5 years to kind of be present across all 28 boroughs of London, and then move from there out into sort of other parts of the UK. So I think it really goes back to that thing of trying to, not from above, not top down, kind of assuming what a culture or community needs, but really being responsive and listening to what is needed, and then providing or responding to it.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to move on to the next one. It's a question from Jez, and I'm going to broaden it out actually, Jez, if you don't mind, and we'll get to your question in particular. But I'm interested really in the impact of land prices on all of these areas around placemaking, and I'm interested in particular, one of the things I've been thinking about with respect to the white paper is the need for more upfront resources to do this development planning and engagement with communities and design and master plan, etc. All really, really good things, but who's going to pay for this, and where is the money going to come from, and what mechanisms are there going to be to actually to make that happen? Because it's a great thing in principle, but it's got to be adequately resourced. So I'd be really interested to hear the three panelists' reflections on, you know, how we're actually going to fund this upfront pulling together of great placemaking under this new system. So perhaps I can start by picking on Steph. Perhaps she'd like to kick off that conversation for us.
It's a really tricky one. The environment has been underfunded for many years now. Even the government's own nature conservation advisors, Natural England, have seen their grant and aid funding go down year on year for a number of years now. So it's in a fairly desperate state. And indeed, most local authorities no longer have a local authority ecologist anymore to advise them. So that is a real struggle, and the level of funding and the level of expertise in the industry has gone down. Most of the expertise is focused, obviously, where the money is in the development sector, and I think that's where a lot of investment is going to come from, again, in this next phase, because through the mechanisms like biodiversity net gain, and possibly latterly companies offsetting their wider biodiversity impacts that will come through legislation over the next few years, I think we're going to see companies paying for that and a market developing, much in the way there is in the US of, if you like, environmental credits or biodiversity credits. So there'll be a kind of a market and a trading system for delivering that. So I think there is a role there. I do, however, think that in setting up a different approach to planning and a different approach to looking after our natural resources, and having committed to what they have in the global biodiversity framework, I do think that there will be a need for central government funding to be invested in this to get that baseline. And the government, there's a sort of a precedent for that, if you like. The government has invested in schemes for great crested newts, which are called district level licensing, where that involves taking away some of the delays for developers at the project stage by doing advanced works and building new pondscapes around in different local authority areas, and so sort of creating the habitat in advance. And so there is a precedent there. The government has had to put its own hand in its pocket to start that system off. And when you look at the sort of savings that you can make through advancing development and getting housing projects delivered, well, you know, perhaps we need to invest some of the benefit to the economy that will be delivered by that into some of these upfront works.
Yes, thank you, and that's the mechanism I'm quite interested in, definitely. Rob, can I turn to you, because you touched on in your talk, you touched on this particular subject, and you talked about options for actually how we get the developer to pay partly for that upfront planning, particularly around archaeology. And I want to supplement the question really by saying, do you think that's going to have an impact on the ambition for the 30-month development plan system? So I'd like to hear a little bit more about your ideas about how we can get the developer to pay earlier in the in the plan making process, and whether that's going to have an impact on the time frame for the development plan process.
Yeah, well, I mean, that arbitrary 30-month development plan timescale, it's very difficult to envisage that for a whole lot of reasons of where you need the time and where you spend that very, very short amount of time, really. But I mean, I just want to make the point broadly before I talk about the specific ways of potentially funding archaeology, ecology, and other things. That for years, every time we've had a stage of reform of the planning process, particularly over the last 10 years, the majority of respondents from the planning sector, development sector, have said you can solve the problems of planning by funding it better. And under-resourcing has been identified as the main reason, the main blockage for many people's views for quite a while. And yet throughout, government has been reluctant, arguably reasonably in an era of austerity, to put in additional resources to fixing some of the systems that we currently have. And now we're in a situation where we're being proposed the most radical changes yet. And again, we're not talking about resourcing. All of the proposals in the white paper, they could be delivered perfectly effectively if they're funded appropriately. Now, the thing about trying to deliver certainty to developers by pulling those processes up front and telling you kind of what you can build where, is that puts the emphasis on where you need the money earlier in the process. And the challenge is, at the moment, developer contributions only come forward when there is a developer and when there is a plan. So there is a question mark there about, is government willing to put up the money that is needed to, as Stephanie says, improve that kind of baseline data that we've got about where areas of ecological significance might be. Same exactly applies for archaeology. We don't have that data in place now. Somebody needs to pay for that to happen. Now, the thing that I mentioned in my talk was about land value capture, and I mention it because the Housing, Communities and Local Government Committee of parliamentarians who've got an inquiry open in parallel to the white paper consultation at the moment, it's an area that they've been focusing on intensely a couple of years ago. And I think it has in real relevance now that we're talking about this front-loaded system. Essentially, landowners get huge uplift on land when it is as a result of policy decisions given over for building. Now, we have a potential here to argue for new ways to capture that uplift earlier in the process so that we can pay for things like improving the baseline data. And it's not in the white paper at the moment. The government don't want to talk about resources, but it is a huge elephant in the room, and I think we really do need to highlight where there are creative opportunities here, or recognize there's a quid pro quo. The more data that you've got, the more money it costs, but the more data you've got, the more certainty you can provide to those developers, and that's essentially what the government wants. How much are they willing to put in to achieving the objectives that they want in terms of efficiency of the system and certainty to developers?
Yes, thanks, Rob. I mean, certainty is really critical, isn't it, to good development, effective development. Certainty is something that we do want to try and achieve. I want to put that question to you, Eve, but I also want to be fair to Jez, because I think we've kind of strayed into the conversation about resources and who pays for those resources and how we actually collect the information that we need to. So I don't know if you just want to respond on that point first, and then we'll perhaps just return to Jez's question to make sure that we've got that covered.
Yeah, I suppose, I mean, the creative sector has been, hasn't had many resources over, forever really. And it's kind of part of the reason we've been set up to try and create a kind of new income stream for property to be acquired, and then those kind of cultural spaces to be locked into communities. One of the pieces of research that we're just looking at putting together at the moment is around the value that creativity brings to a neighborhood. Actually trying to put a pound sign next to it, because of course we understand the benefits, but they're very soft often, and it's very hard to kind of pinpoint. But it's clear to everybody that putting a theater into a neighborhood makes it attractive, and we want to try and see what that kind of cost is, and you know, focus it back to the developer. A really good example is the High Line in New York, which was sort of funded by the project itself and grants, and since it's been a live project, the developments all through Chelsea have just, you know, tripled, quadrupled in value. How can we capture those values before they set in, so that they can actually become circular?
That's quite a trick. Okay,
it's quite a big piece of work.
It is. Hannah, can I just check in with you? Did you want to finish dead on 1:30, or do you want me to finish at 1:30?
I'm happy to go over 5 minutes if our panelists are.
Okay. Yeah, not okay. Okay, so Eve, I'm just going to return to Jez's question just to make sure that I've covered what he's asking, and I'm going to read it out, okay, and then I'm going to look to you to answer. Okay, we've spoken about developers and planning authorities today, but in relation to Eve's work with the Creative Land Trust, would the panel agree that the real issue here is with unsustainable and huge increase in land prices, which in turn increase the costs for developers, which then squeezes return on investment, which then forces up prices for workspaces, apartments and commercial tenants? So how can we fix this cyclical problem at source? Fairer, more sustainable land prices. And I'm going to start with you, Eve.
So hard. because
I put you on the spot.
because land is well, just because land has become so it's been commodified. You know, 15-20 years ago we didn't have the squeeze on space that we have here. I think it's reviewing how we value things, and it goes back to how, you know, sort of that soft power that the cultural sector has. How can we look at a triple bottom line, the environmental, the social, and the financial? Can we create a new way of valuing things that also incorporates that social value, which is crucial? I didn't really answer the question. I don't know how to do it, but it's a new frame that we have to consider.
Okay, thank you. Do our other panelists have any responses to that question?
My only other response to it would be to say that, you know, it's in its infancy, but one of the areas that we're working on at the moment is in valuing the natural capital in land. So trying to get a monetized reflection of what other uses of land are worth, so that it isn't simply that the only way to value land is around its development value, effectively, its agricultural value. You know, there are other ways to value it, and if we want to really develop a society that works for all parts of that society, we've got to take that broader perspective into account.
Yes,
can I just quickly interrupt and say, Rob, I think you're going to have to shoot off soon. Or yes.
Yes, sorry, it is a very related reason. I have another meeting to have to go to explain to parliamentarians exactly what I've been talking about here. So very topical, but thank you everybody, and thank you for a stimulating discussion.
Thanks very much, Rob. Thank you. Okay, I'm going to skip down to a question here from Kay Richardson, and it was for Stephanie and Rob primarily, but Steph, you're just going to have to field this one, I think, on your own. Hang on, it's just gone down my feed. Hang on. Okay, so how do you feel the field of biodiversity is going to respond to the challenges of innovation in data creation and participation? Good question.
Okay, it is a great question. It's a huge question. There are a lot of initiatives going on at the moment in sort of, for a start, in digital data collection and GIS, and actually managing information better, sharing information better. And I think that's hugely important. I mean, biodiversity has for a lot of years worked on a principle of sharing data through local environmental record centres and so on. But I think that writ large is the way forward. So we have a real national understanding of of what our natural infrastructure looks like. You know, what have we got? Where are the places that we should be building back? Where are the places that we should be letting nature take its course? Where are the places that, you know, this is the best place to just grow carrots? And so, you know, we need to get much better at feeding into that and sharing that information centrally. And that's starting, and the government's identifying its nature improvement areas and the recovery zones, and they've got the pilot projects going on at the moment. So we are starting to see movements in that direction. In terms of practically at a practitioner level, we're getting more innovative, I think, in how we do monitoring, because we need to do more, and it's very labour intensive. So there's some really interesting work going on at the moment, looking at measuring sort of indicators of biodiversity using sound. So, you know, if you've got a hay meadow and it's full of life and there's lots of birds and insects and so on, it'll be noisier than a field full of oilseed rape. You know, we have ways of filtering out the anthropogenic noise, obviously. And so, you know, things like this sort of new techniques of just sampling biodiversity, and maybe it won't be quite as we've done it traditionally with people going out with wellies and binoculars, but maybe we've got ways of gathering a lot more information a lot more quickly and feeding that in so that we can use it in real time for decision making.
Thanks, Steph. And I'm going to make this the last part of this session now, Hannah, just to warn you. But I just wanted to ask Eve really on that basis, because I'm quite used to seeing data gathered on the natural environment and the historic environment. I'm not so used to seeing data gathered on the creative sector, and how that is used in planning and placemaking. So I don't know if you have any final ideas about how we might do this and what the benefit would be. You're on mute.
Can you repeat the question? Sorry.
So I was just thinking that I'm quite used to seeing data collected around the natural environment and the historic environment and how we use it, but I'm not so used to seeing data on the creative sector. So do you have any thoughts on how we collect data on the creative sector and what the benefits of doing that might be? And that's the final question in this session.
I mean, there's a lot of work that has been done by some of the local authority organizations. I'm gonna stick specific to London here, but you know, that's been happening nationally. A lot of work really about the protection of space, both cultural venues, but also workspace, and their benefits within the community. And there are sort of, from that have come practical solutions to some of the support that's being created. I mean, actually the Creative Land Trust, who I work for, is the outcomes of that. So absolutely there are opportunities out there. And I think the main thing is that people are coming together now. So I saw there was a question here around how we're going to support during COVID, you know, like with things sort of falling away, organizations falling away. Well, the consortium that we put together with the Sound Diplomacy team and Music Venues Trust was in direct response to that, trying to think of ways that we can actually support these failing organizations, collecting the data, seeing where it is that the stumbling blocks are for them, and having roundtable discussions, you know, getting people on Zoom and saying, we're far apart at the moment, but how can we work together and share knowledge to actually come together in a unified voice?
Thanks very much, Eve. I don't know about the rest of you, but I could quite happily spend all afternoon just chatting away about all these things, but I think we do need to draw it to a close. So can I just thank Eve Blay and Dr. Stephanie Ray and Dr. Rob Lennox, and hand back to you, Hannah.
Thank you very, very much. I thought it was incredibly useful panel discussion, and thank you, Stephanie Evans, for chairing it. So we've gone a bit over time, but I just would like all of the panelists to come back and switch on your videos as I'm going to close now, and I want to say thank you face to face, as they say. But yeah, thank you thanks so much to everyone who joined us, and of course, so much to the speakers, and again, coming on such short notice, so that it wouldn't have been possible, obviously, without you. And I think that we have covered so much. It's been extremely useful to hear different perspectives and approaches, essentially all highlighting how important it is to stay aware and to keep on top of these changes as they pass through Parliament, and to make yourself heard. So I think that was the overall thing about voices and visibility. So thank you all for emphasizing that. And I think it's definitely the case that we will be seeing more changes being put through, even as ministerial statements or different sort of policy instruments in the coming months. So I think it's really important to just have your finger on the pulse when this happens. And just to say that this has been recorded, and I'll try to get this video up in the next few days if I can, in case there's anyone who wants to kind of go back and listen before the close of the planning white paper consultation next week. But also, I do want to signpost you to the heritage-research.org website, which is the website of the AHRC Heritage Priority Area, led by Professor Rodney Harrison and the small team, including myself, that works, where you'll find the videos of most of the events, which include the last two, which is on the climate crisis and sustainability. So we have nature, culture, and I tried to kind of blend different kind of voices together. And this being the last of the follow-on funding events, I really do want to stress that, whether you're involved with research or voluntary work, I think your views and experiences matter. And I think on behalf of everyone, I think we all urge you to be a part of the democratic processes by making yourself heard between elections when change actually happens. And again, advocacy starts with you, and the clockwork doesn't work well without you doing your part. So thank you all for coming to today's event, and I hope it's been useful. And please do get in touch if you have any feedback, thoughts, and questions. And of course, apologies for not being able to get through all the questions, but it was really nice to see people very engaged. So thank you, and have a nice day and weekend. Bye.
Thanks, everybody. Bye.
Big applause.
Thank you.